Warmly welcome everyone to the Quick Tips in Microsoft Business Applications series. Episode 11, D365 FinOps and Power BI. I have a special guest, Justin Trollip, joining with this episode.
I've got an amazing guest, Justin Trollip, joining with me today for quick tips in Microsoft Business Applications episode to share tips about embedded reporting in Power BI with FinOps. He's the enterprise architect at Dialog and speaker in the community, and he contributes to the community as well a lot. So over to you, Justin, for introduce yourself and to share some tips about the Microsoft Business Applications today for the episode.
Okay, thanks so much for having me, Kasan. Yeah, really nice to be here. So yeah, I'll probably keep the introduction short. I'll just jump straight into it. So I'll just share my screen.
Yeah.
So if we want to do, I mean, this is obviously Power BI reports is quite a common request from a lot of customers. You know, so obviously what happens is a lot of customers want to see Power BI reports embedded within FinOps, and a lot of the reasoning is that because they want to save on licensing, they don't want to buy PowerBI.com extra licensing. Also, then it's a single source. You know, when their users come in, they don't have to navigate to multiple places. So the way that we actually do it is at the moment it's fairly complex. There's quite a lot of steps involved in order to do it. So what I'm going to do is I'll just first start off with LCS. So if you've deployed any finance or supply chain or commerce applications, you're probably well aware of LCS. But if we go into one of your LCS projects, and you start looking at your environments, what happens is with Microsoft is with the FinOps implementations, they give you different tiered licensing. So as part of your licensing, you'll always get a standard acceptance test and you'll get your sandbox for your development. As part of these environments, they'll give you multiple VMs. So within the development environment, you can still develop the reports. However, then connecting to the entity store is not going to be a possibility. So what happens is within the application, so the way that Microsoft do it is with AX 2012, you used to have things called SSAS cubes. So you'd connect to those cubes, you then design your reports against those cubes, and then you'd do what you needed to do. Within obviously a cloud-based deployment, the environments are a lot more locked down. Microsoft obviously manage those deployments or in those environments, so your access is a lot more limited. So what I've opened is I've opened just a standard UAT box, and if I actually scroll down, this might not be a good example. Let me go into a different project. But what you'll actually see is they'll give you the AOS, your application object server, then they'll give you a separate box for Power BI. So if we look at, let me just change over here a bit. And then what actually you have to do is, what causes the complication is because you're never going to have access to SQL in the production box, is it's creating that connection. Right, so the way you actually develop these reports for Power BI is you actually have to connect to the entity store via the VM. Then what happens is when you do that deployment, that then will automatically infer the entity store from the production box. So if you look under LCS and you go into your environments, you'll actually see over here, most of your UAT boxes will have numerous VMs. Okay, so under this one over here, you can see there's an AOS, there's a second AOS, and then there's a BR VM. Okay, so we can actually VM into this BR VM, and once we've accessed that VM, we can then actually connect directly to the entity store, and then we can develop reports directly against that. So if you look here, it'll give you your credentials over here in order to access that VM. You can also then see there'll be database accounts. So if you want to connect to it, here's your data warehouse account. So if you want to connect to it, you'll be able to get the string over here, and then you'll also be able to get your user credentials. So to save a bit of time, I've just already saved a VM. So if we look over here, I've connected to the VM. Okay, so the only way, all I've done with that there is the way I've connected to that VM is I've gone in here, I've downloaded the VM from here, I've used these credentials, And then what I've done is just for ease of access is I've saved the VM under remote desktop in Microsoft. So as you know, as your client base grows and as your access to environments, it's just a nice way to manage all of your VMs. So if I actually go in here, what this actually allows you to do is this allows you now to actually install software. So a lot of the VMs are obviously pretty much locked down, but this VM is purely allows you to install, you know, the latest Power BI desktop edition. You can also install the external tools. So let's have a look at, first of all, what that looks like. So if we open Power BI on the desktop, it does take a bit of time to load. So just bear with it.
Yeah, it does use a bit of a lot of RAM.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. So, you know, here's your Power BI desktop that you'll always see, right? So it's consistent throughout. But what you'll see is I've got a recent data sources. So if you actually look there in that Spartan SRV and you look at that URL string, if I then go back into the database accounts, you can actually see that's the same URL I've used, right? So that's actually the URL, and then this here would be your credentials. Well, sorry, yeah, there's your credentials there. So then once you've actually connected to that, you'll see I'll have access to the full entity store. The one thing just to take note of is within the application, you actually need to make sure that you are making sure that the data is flowing through to the entity store. So let me kind of take a quick segue and just show you what that looks like through the front end application. And again, just if you, from the developer box, this isn't possible. So that's just something you got to be aware of. So the actual developer experience of deploying Power BI reports on finance and supply chain, it's not ideal, because normally what would happen is you deploy a report in dev, you test. Once you're happy, you then deploy to UAT and then let your customers. The issue that we're finding at the moment is we don't have that workflow, right? So because in order, I'm just going to open Edge because Microsoft doesn't seem to. Okay, it's working now. So if we look at it, but with that workflow, what some of the frustrations with that is because the way that you actually embed these Power BI reports is you actually have to embed them as part of a workspace. So it's very hard to then debug in dev and then before UAT. So I'm just going to open Edge here because every time I use Firefox, my credentials seem to go out of sync with Dynamics. I'm not sure why, but Edge seems to play a lot nicer. So it's just something to take into account. So if we talk about the workflow of developing an embedded Power BI report, the way that it works is you first connect to the, you deploy the entity store, you then connect to the entity store via the VM, you then develop your report, you then deploy that report in X++ as a workspace. You deploy that to UAT. Once that's happy, as part of that all-in-one deployable package, that workspace will be included. You load your Power BI PBIX file as an artifact, and then you deploy it to production. So as you can see and as you can hear, there's a lot of steps involved in this. Microsoft hasn't really released a roadmap for this side of things, but that workflow I think will change over time, but that's as it is today, the current process as I understand it. So let's just wait for Dynamics to load.
I think they have a road plan to make everything into the data lake for
Into
Power
the
BI into the data lake as well for the Power BI files or the
exactly,
PBIX file. Yeah,
exactly right.
that's the
Yeah.
roadmap.
So we at first thought we could just deploy directly via LCS and shared asset library. That didn't, yeah, we haven't had too much success with that. Data lake is a great point. I mean, every customer, as soon as you mention data lake, their eyes light up. One thing just to consider with data lake is it's raw, right? So what that means is Dynamics FinOps has a very good, very mature security model, but now you're taking that data out of the secure model of finance and supply chain, and you're putting it into an unsecured data lake. So what is often the very hard part of that implementation is making sure that you have a new security layer on the lake.
Yeah,
So what
that's
we
really critical. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So generally, what we do is, as a very high level, is we put the data in the data lake in a zone called unstructured or raw, and that has very limited access. And then from there, we distribute the data out, which then has a subsequent security model attached to it. So let's just go into. So obviously, Power BI configuration needs to be done in order to view reports. So that entails setting up an Azure AD application, which you then link through to FinOps. That will then allow you to read and connect to Power BI. But then Entity Store will also need to be configured. Sometimes just search works really well, sometimes not so much. I think it's under System Admin. Sorry, is it System? There we go.
Yep.
Okay, so these are like, from, if you're coming from an AX 2012 world, or if you're coming from an analysis service, these are your kind of cubes, right? So if you look here, some of these are enabled and some of them aren't. So you can kind of slice and dice whatever you want. You can then specify your refresh recurrence and enforce offline hours. I think this is a fairly new feature that rolled out in the last 1 or 2 versions.
Yeah.
So this is your entity store. So what this is doing is it's taking your cubes and it's actually deploying them and refreshing them with fresh data. So what a lot of customers they'll choose the data sets they actually want to use, and then they'll set up their refresh schedule. So if we think about it, we've now set up entity store, we've now got the VM, we've logged in, and now we can actually start developing our report. So if I go in here, you can see I've got all my measures. So some of the terminology that Microsoft uses is aggregated measures. So you can actually create your own custom aggregated measures in X++ code. So what happens is some customers have like customized fields. So really it's quite an interesting one, right? Because now what happens is you can create the custom fields through the front end.
Yeah.
Those custom fields, from my understanding, don't automatically flow through into your entity store and your aggregated measures. So there just needs to be some form of governance that if a customer is self-creating a lot of custom fields and they're using Power BI extensively, you just got to make sure that, that those fields are actually then included in your aggregated measurements. So some customers will then use a combination, so they'll use OData for their master data, and perhaps config, and then they'll use the entity store for transactional data. So it's good to kind of differentiate what strategy you want to use for. OData is fine for some reports. However, it's never going to be the Rolls Royce in terms of speed. So yeah. And there's also limits, right? So some customers they use common, or what's Dataflex, supposedly called Dataflex, but everyone knows there's common data service at the moment. However, there are limits to what you can actually store there. So we've had a few customers thinking that they could then use common data service for reporting, but then because of the amount of data they're pushing there, they reach their licensing limits. So it's just something to take into consideration. So this is actually awesome. Like, what I really love about this is it's actually so smart. It actually can infer your financial dimensions and then automatically create them. So let's say, for example, you got a financial dimension called responsibility center. It's actually smart enough to actually then create the measures based upon that financial dimension against the kind of modules. So it's really smart. But let's say, for example, we wanted to build, just something like on the project subledger, this type project, and there's your project accountant cube. So now we can kind of slice and dice and we can start creating this report. Another thing to take notice of, or just be aware, is when you actually create these tables or put them in, it doesn't automatically infer the relationship. So let's say, for example, I wanted to bring in customer, okay, and I wanted to bring in project. So let's say, for example, I wanted to do some very basic reporting based upon the customer versus the project. Within the current version, it's not smart enough to infer the relationship between the customer and the project. So before we get into that, I'll just quickly talk about import and direct query. So Microsoft recommends uses direct query. That's obviously then, it then means your data and your reports are more real time, if you will. So I won't spend too much time on direct query, going into technical details, but just take a note, Microsoft does recommend using direct query. And that obviously throws in some limitations, right? So direct query can and can't do some things that the other version does. So just be aware of that.
Yeah, exactly. There's some limitations with the DAX as well. If you use the direct query,
Yeah.
there's few limitations. Right?
So I've just gone in now. So you see there, my tables have come in. But if I look at relationships over here, there's no relationship. So it hasn't inferred it, right? So in the, I think the July edition of Power BI, if you now import in cubes from SQL Server Analysis Service, it automatically infers the relationships. That unfortunately is still not the case with Dynamics.
Yeah.
So I think it's going to come. If they've done for this the analysis cubes, there's a logical next step is it will come for Dynamics. But as of today, that doesn't occur.
Yeah.
So this adds a lot of well, for me it's governance, right? Because what happens is if you're defining your own relationships, what often happens is if you've got a team of Power BI reporters, they might define relationships differently, and you can't then ensure or guarantee consistent data results. So this is a big challenge. So the way we actually do it is, let's say, for example, we created a relationship over here. Microsoft has just moved to a new concept called a tabular, I think it's called a tabular object model. I'm not sure the exact terminology, but what that means is it's actually a way of defining your schematics of your data model. Right? So then what happens is it defines the relationships. It also then defines your measures, right? So let's say, for example, we're creating a measure over here, and we're calling this just test measure. So how do we ensure that when we actually distribute these models, that every developer throughout the organization is using the same data model, right? So they can use the same measures. We don't have to redefine measures every time. We don't have to redefine relationships. That consistency is key. So Microsoft's pretty cool. They've actually added this tab called external tools. So within the community, some very talented people have actually created these external tools to help with Power BI reporting. So the common ones are ALM Toolkit, DAX Studio, and Tabular Editor. Now they each have kind of different functionalities, but we're going to just quickly talk about a Tabular Editor. So the tabular editor actually allows you to save this data model, right, in a file format called like a BIM. So if I actually open one, and I've got a project one, for example, what I can see here is all of the relationships will be defined on this BIM. So if I was starting a new project, I would then make sure that every Power BI developer starts with the same BIM. Okay, let's make sure that there's no inconsistencies. Also, what happens is, let's say there's 5 different Power BI developers, and we realize that there's been an incorrectly configured relationship.
Yeah.
We want to make sure that when we roll out a change to fix that relationship, all 5 of those developers are getting the latest data model. So this is when we start getting into things like source control, governance of how do we manage these models. So the way that we recommend it, or that I personally recommend it, is you take this BIM file, you define all of your relationships in a base model as well as your measures, right? Because what happens is, even your tables, there's measures. So so if I look at I'm sure I've got some measures in here that I've got my projects. It's probably on actual RU. So I've created these custom measures called non-chargeable hours. Again, it's nothing, crazy advanced or anything, But what we want to do is we want consistency across all developers, okay? Because if I'm creating my own, I might create non-chargeable hours, but maybe Jill in accounting is like a budding Power BI reporter, and she creates a called NCH.
Exactly.
And now if I inherit that report, I don't know what that means. I don't. There's no consistency, and then the actual organization doesn't ensure consistent results. So the way you do that is you have some form of steering committee, or you have some form of governance panel. They create these BIMs. They are the masters or the owners of these BIMs. And then what we do is we check it into Git. So we create a source code repository. And then what happens is you have two branches, right? So for example, within Azure DevOps, you'd create a Git repository. You'd have master, which is your kind of production BIM. And then you'd have another one called develop. So anytime someone wanted to change that BIM, they'd create changes in the develop branch, and they'd submit a pull request down to. So let's talk a little bit about source control. So Microsoft for Finance, and most X++ or AX developers are much more used to TFES, right? So Team Foundation Version Service.
Yeah.
So the one issue I find, well, I actually find a few issues with that as a version control system, is it's actually a file-based centralized version control system. So the way that you make a new branch is you actually create a new directory, whereas Git does all sort. Git is amazing, right? So for example, if I've got a source code over here, and I'm using Git, I can then click over here, I can create a new branch, and I can call this develop. And when I'm actually in develop, I can create a file, for example, test.com. And when I switch over to master, okay, I haven't checked it in. Let me just check. Let me actually just check all of these latest codes in. That file will disappear. So it also allows you to do much more effective pull requests. So if you look at like a pull request on GitHub, it allows you to do all sorts of things actually. So the nice thing about a pull request is it actually allows you to do things like approvers. So you can actually set up policies on pull requests. So you can say, okay, so Justin is actually in charge of this BIM, but Jill from accounting, she's made some changes or requested some changes. She's issued a pull request, but I have to approve them before they get merged into that. So I won't spend too much time because I've already probably segued a bit too far off course here. So let's go back into the actual report. So let's actually start creating a bit of this report, right? So now what we can do is you can see I can create a connection here. So sometimes these values aren't always the most descriptive. So if I want to create a relationship here, there's my key for the customer, which is the rec ID. And now I've got to actually look in here to find where I can find that customer. So if you can see there, that's not going to match. So that's actually the customer ID, whereas over here, this is actually, this is actually the project. So sometimes what they've done is they've got these foreign keys throughout the system. Which can link, but let me actually choose. You can see sometimes what you're going to do is you're going to create a customer project and you're going to find there's actually no natural linkage. So over here, if I actually look through here, there's no natural way I can link customer and project within this. Okay, and the reason why is I've actually chosen the incorrect table. So if I actually go back here and I go into recent sources and I go to project, you'll actually see there's another one called projects.
Okay.
So sorry, over here. Projects. So you've just got to be a bit careful, right? So that's one of the challenges of not inferring those relationships automatically. You have to play, you have to explore to find these relationships. They're not just gonna present themselves to you. So let's actually add this projects, and let's add some actuals. So where are my actuals? So let's just add actuals. So the one thing that I tend to do is I also start renaming these because they get quite verbose pretty quick. So if you look here, we can know that that project we don't care about. So I'm just going to delete that one. But the nice thing is, even if you rename these fields, rename these tables, when you actually deploy it, embed it into Dynamics, it still actually recognizes it fine. So you don't have to worry about any of that. Okay, so now we've actually got, you see, and the reason why I rename it is because they got such long names, it becomes very hard to actually view what you're looking at. So let's just rename these. Okay, cool. So now, I mean, I normally kind of just try to keep my central table in the middle. I mean, that's more just a personal preference, but let's now create those relationships. Okay, so now what we're going to do is there'll be a project foreign key, I believe. There, okay. So Microsoft's given you kind of these helper fields, right? So if you look here, it's got these underscore customer underscore foreign key. And these are often, you know, the first places. Some tables don't have them, unfortunately, but that's generally your best place to start. Like, yeah, you can see it doesn't actually have one, yeah, for customer, right? Where did I see customer? Okay. So that looks okay. Let's just wait for it to validate. That does look like the right one. You see, but so this is the thing, right? So you normally start creating these relationships, but then what you'd want to do, or what I personally would do, is save them as a BIM file to make sure that I don't have to start from scratch every time.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great point actually. That you can use that Beam files to start with it. Otherwise, you have to spend considerable time, and then you might not know whether the model is same or not.
Exactly, and you can define them like kind of in logical grouping. So you might want to create like a project BIM, an AR, a budgeting, a ledger, and then you just reuse what you want. Okay, so that's all good. Now we're going to just create a relationship between project and actuals. So just look here, that hopefully there's a foreign key here. So there's a project foreign key. There we go.
Yeah.
So you see, so often they do exist, but sometimes, like you saw with the customer, it doesn't exist. And there's normally a reason for that, because generally what will happen is in projects, it should actually go project contract, because there might be multiple customers per contract. So I won't go into that, you know, but if it is missing that foreign key, there's generally a good reason why. But for the purpose of this, you know, we won't go too much into that. And now we can really go, you know, we can really start doing a whole bunch of stuff, right? So if I want to go into actuals and I want to look at actual hours, you know, there's my actual hours. If I then want to then add the project, there, we can start building our reports, right? So another thing that I normally do is generally what I'll do is I'll actually create like some form of filter. So for example, what I do is, let's just, because what happens is obviously as you build these reports, there's more and more kind of filters, right? So someone will want to filter by the project name. They'll want to report by the sales manager. They want to report by maybe legal entity. And what happens is if I then create slices for all of that, the whole thing becomes huge, right? So, oh, sorry, let me just change that. So let's say I create a whole bunch of slices, yeah. What then happens is the actual data that your customers want to look at you start running out of room, right? And then you start and what you'll see when you embed it in Dynamics is it doesn't actually give you a full screen. It gives you kind of like this limited window. Yeah. So what I do is, let's say I put all my slices in here. Let's call that sales manager. Let's call this project manager, and let's call this project name. So what I do is I'll normally insert let's look at a visual. I'll have a text box here, or maybe not a text box. Probably a button's more effective. Come on. Let's just do a shape. Okay, so then what you can do is you can actually hide these based upon a whole bunch of things. So if I look here, we've got a thing called bookmarks. So what you can actually do is you can create these bookmarks, which then kind of slices and dices. So we'll just do a very simple one, which is show data, and then we'll create one called show filters. Okay, so show data. When we have this, we only want to see this. So all we do is we just hide all the slices. Okay, so then we go here and we update it. Then when we want to show the filters, we want everything, but we don't want that. Yep. So now we update that. And then we just use this button and we add an action to it, which is a bookmark. And we say show data. So then if I click that, it shows the data. So that's kind of when you start becoming, you know, the report's not just this dumb report. It's actually a report that your users can start to, you know, navigate through, and it starts becoming very effective. So yeah, I mean, that's really how you design Power BI reports. Again, if you want to create measures, you know, you could go in here and you could go to your actuals and you could create a new measure. And then, you know, obviously then depending on how experienced you are with Power BI, you know, you can really do a lot of stuff. You can then start linking this to variables. You know, often what will happen is we get quite a lot of requests that people want to compare financial data. So they want to see, okay, what is my budget versus my forecast versus forecast 2. And that's when you can start getting into some really, yeah, quite nice scenarios, what if analysis.
Yeah. Exactly, and then you have to use probably a lot of the DAX queries and stuff like that to link it up and then bring it up, relationships. It's a good thing,
yeah. Yeah, and Power BI is so trendy nowadays, if you will.
Yeah.
That really, you know, most customers, sheesh, that they really want to engage in the platform. So yeah, I mean, that's your Power BI report. Now, if you're ready to deploy it, now what you got to do is you got to save this PBX file. So Power BI files are all saved in a PBIX format. So the one thing that I do is just be conscious if we're using the tabular object model. I'm not sure if this is going to cause issues. We've done a few deployments this last week that failed, and I think it's to do with the fact that we've turned on a preview feature, which is enhanced metadata format. So that metadata format, if this is turned off, you won't be able to see this BIM. Okay, so that's just a little gotcha. But I don't know if it's stable enough for Dynamics because we had quite a few failed deployments, and I'm not sure, but I believe it might be due to that. So just something to be a bit careful of when deploying your reports. But let's say we've saved this report now. So, we've got these reports and now we want to deploy them. Now you actually need an X++ developer. So what the kind of cycle is you'll come in here and you'll have to create a workspace. So for example, you'll create a workspace in X++. So it's if you go, let's just go to Google because Bing always struggles, but there's actually, Microsoft's documentation has really improved a lot over the last few years. But if you go Dynamics 365 deploy Power BI, let's just find the link here. Yeah. So it's all in the Microsoft Dockers, right? So it's just add analytics to workspaces. So this actually gives you the code, it gives you everything. So what would happen then is in your LCS, you'd actually have to open that developer box, right? So over here, as we mentioned earlier, this is a sandbox environment for UAT. But if I wanted to then write the X++ code in order to embed that report, I'd need to then log into the development environment. From that development environment, I would then need to add the PBX file as a resource. So now what happens is also Microsoft's moved to all-in-one deployments. So then this PBX file will be version controlled. And then what you do is you've got to, if you've written X++ code, you'll be able to follow this document pretty easily. It's not that complex. The hard thing is you only know if it fails once the deployment's gone through, which can be super frustrating because, if it fails, then you've got to do a redeployment, repackage. But and there you go, right? So there you can see there's your Power BI report. We've created one. As I mentioned, we had a few failed deployments this week, but where have we created it? Project management, we created one.
Okay.
Oh no, sorry, it's project reporting. And there it'll come up with that and then it'll embed it, right? So that's the kind of workflow. And then you go to, so that's pretty much how to do it. There's a lot to take in there.
Yeah.
I definitely understand that. And I think that's why sometimes we have to educate our customers, because what often happens is they see the demos, they see these people on stage and they've got these beautiful embedded reports and everything works and it's beautiful, and they go, I want that. And then you go, well, it's not that easy, and there's obviously some complexities, and that's where you've got to help your customers understand the journey. It's a good journey, but it's one that you need to put the foundations in place from the start, or it's going to break fairly quickly.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Justin, we covered a lot of ground in this space within the short span of time.
Yeah, and I'm sorry if I rushed over it.
No, it's really good. It's really good. I think it's good for our viewers and stuff like that. So it's wonderful that you covered a lot of ground in the Power BI, and you go into a lot of sharing a lot of great tips like BIM and stuff like that. How you do actual development and stuff like that. So it's really good. It's really good. Wonderful. And thanks for joining with me for the Key to MBA show. And I'll definitely leave your LinkedIn profile in the comments so that anyone want to contact you, definitely contact you for any further questions they have. That'll be really great, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Let me know. Look, I know there's a lot to take in, so yeah, just ping me if you get stuck and you need any help.
Thanks a lot, Justin.
Yeah.
And stay tuned for more episodes coming up. And thanks for watching this episode. Thank you. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you. Cheers.